"I don't need medicine that will bring you pain," Million told her. He looked at her solemnly as he told her that just like before, he wished she wouldn't experience any sort of pain. He would rather she smile and laugh brightly just like today. As he spoke, he reached up intending to caress her cheek, but stopped as she looked up with bright blue eyes. He cleared his throat, embarrassment covering his face, but Karina was oblivious to it all. He looked away, still blushing as he thanked her for her thoughtful gesture, but it was unnecessary since it would cause her pain, and she quickly dispelled his worries as she told him that making the medicine wouldn't require a lot of her power. She explained more at his look of confusion. Because it was an inanimate object, it wouldn't need much power compared to a living thing. He told her that he had the necessary strength to protect himself, so he needn't borrow power from her, but she knew that. She knew how strong he was, but she'd wanted to make it in case an unexpected incident occurred. She looked at him with doe eyes as she asked sweetly, couldn't she help him in that way? Million blushed even more at her cute look, at her beautiful face and sweet voice. But he couldn't give in to her pleading. He knew a medicine such as that would attract the greed of many. How much danger it would attract if people were to find out she could make a medicine with such power. She looked thoughtful at his words, but then firmly said that she would only give this medicine to Million alone. Million sighed and grasped his head tiredly in the face of her stubbornness. They would, of course, keep it a secret, but he worried if word got out around to the soldiers, the havoc this rumor would create. How would she be able to deal with the rumors? She looked down as she told him that it's never crossed her mind. But her next word surprised him as she said, "But if I told you I'm not scared because I'm by your side, would you be angry?" But her confidence vanished as she worried her words might bother him, and she began to apologize. She wrung her hands nervously as she spoke, but his hands reached out to grasp hers as he questioned her. Why would he find her words bothersome? But wouldn't her words burden him, she'd wanted to know? She looked up in surprise as the sweetest words left his lips. He told her that she wasn't a bother to him, and if she wanted, she could bother him as much as she'd like. Because hate was something he'd never felt for her. They stood like that, their hands held together as the wind blew, happiness and tenderness for each other surrounding them. Million thought about his initial feelings for Karina in the beginning and could admit that she was indeed a bother because he disliked having to look after other people. In fact, his current actions surprised him the most. When he thought about Karina Leopold, what she liked and her interests, whether she suffered in pain again, he'd wanted to know it all. Every detail about her intrigued him. He reached up and gently touched her cheek, a touch that she leaned into with her smile. He could no longer deny this feeling. He'd already suspected what it was. He smiled at her actions as he asked her if she disliked him. Still with that beautiful smile on her face, her eyes little crescent moons of happiness, she'd told him that she could never hate him. "I'm glad," he responded. Pleasure brightened his face at her words. But a purple butterfly broke the spell cast on them. They both looked up in surprise, but it was not one but many butterflies that surrounded them. And Karina was amazed, her first glimpse of what real butterflies looked like. How beautiful they were as their little wings fluttered about, carrying them freely. They walked hand in hand along the stream as Karina spoke of how she'd much enjoy it if they could visit this place once again. But next time she'd like to paint. Million promised that they would be sure to make another trip here together in the future. After their outing, they'd returned to the mansion, where Karina now stood with Periel in front of another set of doors she'd painted once again. She'd wanted to know if Periel would be attending the banquet that was soon to be held, but he told her that he could always attend next time. Right now, he wanted the world to know of Karina's beautiful paintings, and for that to happen, he needed to start planning right away. His sincere words reached Karina, and she thanked him for all his help and kindness. She said that the doors she drew would lead to a secluded street away from prying eyes. Before he left, he looked at Karina fondly as he told her to have twice as much fun at the banquet for him as well. And she waved him off as she wished him a safe trip. Brilliant light shined, indicating her miracle activated, but Karina noticed the usual pain that accompanied her miracle was not there. When she was younger, her body would react with excruciating pain right after performing her miracle, but now she could feel nothing of the sort, no matter how much she used her ability, and she knew why. She knew her disease got worse because now her body was gradually becoming desensitized to the pain. She thought about her conversation with Periel and the taboos he spoke about how she'd painted when she was younger, just to forget her loneliness. She couldn't have imagined that she was committing taboos every time she drew just to quail her sadness. She took her paint palette, and she sat. She decided to paint a little before tonight's banquet. She smiled, a little excited about what the night had in store for her. She began mixing her paint as she painted beautiful scenery, but stopped as she suddenly lost sensation in her hand. The paintbrush dropped to the floor, and she looked at her hand. She'd tried to deny it. She got up and walked out of the room. She still had a lot to prepare for the banquet tonight. All the while, the pain got worse. It struck her unexpectedly as she descended the stairs. She sweated profusely as she tried to stay calm, but the pain got worse with every step she took. She still had 4 months left. Nothing should have happened. Unable to ignore it anymore, she crouched down as she moaned at the burst of pain in her chest. She felt dizzy and she'd lost control of her limbs. Had her life shortened? Would the pain get better if she'd painted? Maybe if she created another miracle, it would stop the pain. She got up slowly, intending to do just that, but heard her name being called. She looked up to see Million, who stood at the bottom of the staircase. He looked at her questioningly, and she too was surprised to see him there. He noticed her unkempt appearance and asked her if she'd just had a seizure, and she stuttered out an answer as he approached her. He interrupted her as he told her it's okay not to tell him, but then he lifted her up into his arms, an action which startled Karina, and he walked back up the stairs. Exhausted and in pain, she sagged against him. He took her to her room and laid her on the bed. He sat next to her just as she apologized. She tried to endure the pain but failed in the end. He looked at her concerned as he told her that she didn't need to apologize for something like that. Seeing her hide her pain like that hurt him too. He stroked her forehead, brushing her hair back as he told her to always show him how she truly felt. As tears fell from her eyes, he comfortingly told her that everything would be all right. She cried, because how was Million able to figure out that she usually hid her pain when even her family, who she'd stayed with for 20 years, hadn't noticed it? She cried more at his consideration for her, and Million mistook it as her crying out in pain. He stood up as he questioned whether he should call Winston, and she cried harder. Feeling helpless, all he could do was gather her into his arms as he told her not to cry, panicked at the sight of her tears. Face pressed into his chest, she told him that she was fine, but he knew she'd lied. She was not fine at all. He told her not to endure it in front of him. She thanked him softly, but in his comforting arms, she was plagued with doubts. If she wasn't in pain, would Million still treat her the same? Would they have gotten married and had a normal married life? She pulled back and looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes as she told him the pain was much better now. Noticing the wet patch she'd left on his shirt, she looked at it distressed because soon the banquet would begin, and he couldn't attend dressed that way. But he looked unconcerned as he told her all he had to do was change his clothes. But looked up as he informed her that tonight was actually a party before the banquet and not the actual banquet, so she could stay in and rest for the night. But Karina was confused because she'd never heard of this before. He went on to explain that this was a northern tradition where a day before the banquet, everyone would gather and celebrate with a drink. Karina stared at him, and he looked away nervously. He explained everything to her as if explaining to a child. Was this consideration because he cared for her since she was sick, or could it be something more? He got up and told her to rest because he had arrangements to take care of. She watched him leave. Would there ever be a day when he would treat her not out of compassion, but out of love? She lay back on the bed and covered her eyes. No, She couldn't misunderstand his words or actions. He only treated her with such care because she was sick. Million opened the door to find his butler, who stood quietly as usual. He told him not to bother Karina because she was unwell and she was to rest. Million's next words confused the butler. Tonight would be a pre-party before the banquet. The banquet was to be postponed for one day. The butler watched his back as he questioned what a pre-party was, and Million told him everyone could drink as much as they'd like for tonight because the banquet would be held tomorrow. The butler shouted out for the Duke to stop, but the door shut with a resounding click behind him. The butler was left standing there, flabbergasted. He smacked his head as he sighed tiredly about the fury the nobles would soon express because of this sudden news. The butler stood before a table full of nobles as he explained the happening of the pre-party and a skillfully disguised excuse as to why the Duke would not be attending for the evening. He bowed respectfully as he relayed Million's words to drink to their heart's content tonight as the banquet will be postponed for a day. Baron Kromba slammed his fist against the table in anger at the Duke's actions. Why would he gather everyone here only to send a message like this? Viscount Ariel smiled slyly as she mockingly spoke about his past brusque manner of speech, as he'd always ordered to finish the banquet early. The Baron smiled boyishly as he told the Viscount that they indeed viewed the Duke in a comparable way, and they felt a sense of companionship as they laughed. Count Leonhardt swirled his red wine and brought the glass to his lips as he concluded that the meeting for the subjugation would take place tomorrow. Tonight would be acceptable since they could drink as much as they wanted. But of course, nobles would always be nobles, and they loved to gossip. They raised speculations that Duke Pastelio, who for the first time postponed a banquet, probably had something to hide, but whatever could it be? The butler stood off to the side, listening to their conversation with his lips sealed. Million walked towards Karina as he asked her how she felt, and she told him she'd felt much better. She also apologized for making him worry, but he only smiled, glad because her pain had come to pass. He asked for permission to sit beside her, and as she gave her consent, he plopped down on the bed beside her. He'd surprised her because she'd expected him to sit in his usual seat, which was the chair. He told her that he was to take all the herons that would be collected during the subjugation, and that was what he'd planned to tell the nobles who came today. He looked down as he told her to do her best to hold on. At his words, she stared, but then called out his name softly as she, too, looked down, her bangs hiding her eyes. She wrung her hands, a nervous habit of hers, as she asked him, "Why are you being so nice to me?" He smiled as he spoke with conviction. All he wanted was for Karina to be safe. He wanted her to be able to paint freely and happily for years to come. He wished for nothing in return but that simple wish to be granted. His words should have made her happy, but it hurt more to know she wouldn't be there in the future as he'd wanted. She knew that his wish was something that wouldn't come true. She hesitantly asked him if he could grant her the favor of allowing her to join them on the subjugation, and her words shocked him. She'd wanted to spend more time with the person she liked because when Million leaves for the subjugation and returns, 2 or 3 months would have passed. She tried to convince him that she would be safely tucked away in the back, and she wouldn't be in the way, but he exclaimed loudly that it would be too dangerous. If she wanted to go outside so badly, they could after he returned from the subjugation. He told her that the place they'd be going to was considered dangerous for even skilled knights. As he spoke, her face turned red, eyes glassy, the beginnings of tears that were soon to follow. Her next words stunned Million into silence. "I just want to be with you for a little longer, Million," Karina said, longing in her voice. After a moment of silence, he'd stuttered out in a shaky voice, "Really?" Karina, who'd only just realized what came out of her mouth, blushed in embarrassment. Panicked, she'd tried to cover up her blunder as she'd told him that being at the mansion every day had become extremely stuffy, and she didn't want to be alone. Meanwhile, Million sat with a flushed face as he listened to her explain herself. Karina pouted adorably as she promised to be useful, but Million cleared his throat as he looked away. "I don't need your help, but when you say it like that, I'll think about it." A rare smile graced her lips as she happily said how much his words meant to her. Million's eyes widened in wonder, and he covered his face to hide the deep blush her beautifully smiling face had caused. He needed to control himself, and he got up to leave. He told her to sleep more, but Karina grabbed his hand to stop him, not wanting him to leave yet. She looked down as she told him how their time together wasn't enough. Million's control snapped the moment she grasped his fingers shyly, and he turned. He interlocked their hands with one hand and caressed her cheek with the other as he told her, "This is because you seduced me." And then Million kissed her. They kissed for a long time, and when they broke apart to take a breath, Karina tried to protest. "Wait," she said, but Million didn't give her time to say more, because he sifted his fingers into her hair as he pulled her close, and he kissed her once more. Karina soon gave up any sort of complaint as she grasped him by his neck and pulled him closer as their lips stayed locked together. Karina felt extremely embarrassed, but her happiness outweighed it because she finally got to kiss Million. As their sweet kiss came to an end, both out of breath, they leaned onto each other, heads together, hands still intertwined as they caught their breath. They sat side by side, and silence hung heavy in the air. What just happened now? Did it happen because Million had feelings for her, or was it out of sympathy? Doubts began to creep in. She'd liked how freely Million acted with her. The feeling when he holds her hand or he gently strokes her hair back, she liked it all, but maybe it was all out of sympathy for her. He was human with emotions, so whether it was out of sympathy or affection mattered not. Because in the end, the outcome remained the same. "Million, you're a man with a heart of gold," she told him with a bittersweet smile. At her words, Million looked at her as he gave her his full attention. She knew she held no special place in his heart, but then again, loving someone who was about to meet their end seemed so tragic. After listening to her, he questioned her abrupt line of thought, and she looked away, a sorrowful mask that covered her face as she explained that she'd never been comforted in such a way before. And as her words reached his ears, his eyes widened in shock. "Comforted?" he questioned in a horrified tone. Their first kiss had been explosive, an attraction he couldn't deny, and his body had moved on its own, an impulsiveness that couldn't be explained. Never before had he felt an attraction to someone so acutely. He couldn't even pinpoint the exact moment she went from some annoying noble lady to Karina, his dear first love. His hands that had stroked her hair gently but awkwardly at first now knew nothing more but the natural action of reaching for her. Comforting her when she's in pain, he couldn't say when exactly he wanted to start fighting for her happiness. But her words just now made his heart sink into the pit of his stomach. He was not affectionate enough to comfort someone with a kiss. And maybe she knew this and pitied his love. Did she brush it off as comfort so as not to hurt him? "So for you, it was nothing but comfort," he said softly, miserably, and it alarmed Karina enough for her to look up at him, but he smiled as he told her that if she'd wanted to think of it as only comfort, well, that was okay too. Karina panicked as she heard his words, and she stuttered out an excuse. She wanted to sleep now since she felt quite tired. He gently patted her head as he bid her farewell. "If you feel unwell, call me any time," he said, and with those parting words, he left. Karina smiled as she thought about how thoughtful Million truly was. He'd left with no anger on his face or in his actions, even though he knew she'd told a lie. She buried her face in her legs as she spoke it out loud. "I love you," she said bittersweetly. But she knew they were not meant to be, for if she ever pursued her ambition to win his heart, she knew that would only hurt Million in the end. She said it out loud again, into the quietness of her room where no one would hear her. "I like you, Million." Having tea in the greenhouse was how they usually spent their time now, but as she sat across from him and observed his behavior, she concluded that Million seemed fine. Pretending like nothing had happened, only she felt the awkwardness of the previous night's encounter. He caught her staring and called out her name, and his voice startled her. He told her that he would allow her to accompany him on the subjugation, but she also needed to put her own safety as top priority. Hertha was there, and it would be able to keep her safe, but Million still held worry for her. She offered to make the liquid medicine for Million and the soldiers, but he smiled as he gently shut down the idea of her using her ability. She sat quiet, a bit glum at the thought of not being able to be useful, but his next words froze the air in her body. "I would like it if you didn't use your miracle in exchange for your life force." She looked up as he sat across from her with his arms folded. His posture made his words all the more intimidating. Did Million know about her condition? And that question scared her even more. Karina smiled nervously as she pretended not to know what Million spoke about. But he discarded her lie as he told her he'd heard everything from Periel. Karina closed her eyes tightly as she waited for scalding words she'd expected once he found out. But they never came. "Your life as an artist may end, so you need to be careful," he said. Karina's eyes popped open as she realized Periel hadn't told Million that she had limited time left to live, but rather that her life as a painter would end. Karina readily agreed, and then she asked him if someone close to him were to die. Would Million feel saddened by it? And he didn't deny the truth in that. His words sparked conviction in her, and she firmly stated that she'd like to help Million because she regarded Million as her hero. Her words brought a smile to his lips, and he said that she was included in the list of people that would sadden him with their deaths. She must have heard wrong. His words surprised her, and he repeated himself much more clearly. "If you die, I'm going to be incredibly sad," Million told her, "so don't die." She looked at him, his words laden with meaning. How much had she wished for someone to say those words to her? But hearing it now squeezed her heart painfully so, and those words suffocated her, squeezing out what air she'd had in her lungs. Million, unaware of her dire thoughts, continued to speak. He told her how she would need to see spring once the subjugation was over, so she needed to survive the arduous trip. But spring was the season she wouldn't be able to see with her own eyes, she thought sadly. Because once that season came, she would leave this world forever. Million made plans for their future unaware that she wouldn't be with him later on. He promised to take her to the northern waterfall come springtime. He spoke of how breathtakingly beautiful the waterfall in the north was. She'd never seen a waterfall in real life before, and she couldn't wait to see it together with Million. But she'd be able to experience all the seasons from now on. She'd be able to see a different winter from the one she was used to. The north might be vast, but there were many sights to see. She let out a strained laugh and said with much effort that, with all that he'd said, she might settle down in the north. Her words made her even more aware that she wouldn't live to see another season. Million pulled her from her thoughts as he called out her name. He looked at her seriously as he asked her, "If I say that I don't mind, would that trouble you?" Her clear blue eyes met his as she stared at him stunned. He told her that he'd be fine if she'd like to stay here, and his words brought on an onslaught of guilt that she'd been trying to hold back because she'd continuously lied to Million and it weighed on her. Million tried to convince her of his sincerity as he spoke of his home. Although the north wasn't as warm as the south and there wasn't a variety of foods, the north made up for it with spectacular views that, if she wished, she could paint. He wasn't forcing her, and ultimately the decision was up to her. But he'd like it if she could ponder on the idea of staying here. Karina bunched up her dress in fistfuls and squeezed tightly as he spoke. She thanked him as she told him that she'd think about it, and she looked down dismayed that she would have to lie to Million until she drew her last breath. She picked up her spoon and ate, but she could taste nothing in the face of her guilt. Oh, how she adored him, she thought woeful. Periel stood in a large hall as he gazed at the covered canvases that lay on the floor. Some attendants stood to the side as they called him. Were those all the paintings to be moved they'd wanted to know? And he told them that these paintings were the only ones set to be on display. He directed them as he ordered them to hang the paintings on the marked locations on the walls. One attendant commented on how large and extravagantly decorated the hall was for such few paintings and another worryingly asked if 3 paintings would be enough for such a beautiful space. But Periel believed in the paintings before him because, while they weren't the most perfect paintings out there, the strength of these paintings would capture the eyes of many. Rumors have already begun to circulate throughout the capital. Paintings from a painter with art disease. The vividness of each painting captured your sight and makes you feel as if you are in the scenery itself, so real and lifelike the paintings seem to be. Because while they may be rumors now, soon many will come to know those rumors as truth. He told his attendants to keep spreading word of anonymous painter Karina, but to keep in mind that the Carlos family knew nothing. The servants bowed in consent to their master's words. Periel stared up at the paintings hung on the walls of the hall. He would grant Karina her wish because once the exhibition ends, people would know about her, and soon the world would know of the famous painter, Karina. He would make her a painter to be envied far and wide. The 2 men sat in the carriage as they stared at the growing crowd. The blonde man curiously asked what all the fuss was about, and the black-haired man scoffed at him for his lack of awareness about capital gossip. He then explained about the exhibition that was arranged by the Carlos family, which was the most famous topic in the capital recently. The exhibition had garnered so much attention that it was rumored that even the emperor showed interest. The blonde man was shocked by this. What type of exhibition was this that even the emperor paid attention to? It showcased masterpieces of a genius painter who suffered from artist disease. The paintings were said to be so extraordinary that if you stood in front of one, it was as if you'd stepped into the scenery itself. The black-haired man's explanation interested the blonde man so much he got up with much excitement as he exclaimed that he would also like to see these amazing works of art. Back in the hall, people buzzed around, excitement in the air as they viewed the beautiful artworks. But who was this Karina the painter? There were many speculations. Some said she was a child, but others assumed that was just an alias of a great man. But no matter what stories were told about Karina the painter, the Carlos family remained silent, claiming they knew nothing. After the viewing of the artwork, they were put up for auction where many nobles threw their gold away to win these masterpieces. The Carlos family introduced 6 paintings that were to be auctioned off, much to the nobles' delight, and it came to be known as the Golden Age of the Unknown Artist. Periel stood off to the side, out of view, as he watched the paintings sell in high demand, and he seemed extremely pleased with the result. Although the paintings were unfinished artwork, that didn't seem to hinder the people's desire to possess it. He recalled his conversation with Karina as she told him that leaving her artwork unfinished was much more difficult than she had anticipated. But he told her that although the paintings were unfinished to her, no one else would be aware of her lack of the finishing stroke, and they would still sell, and she laughed nervously. She looked up at him, and her ocean blue eyes seemed more enchanting than usual as she smiled and thanked him. While the auction had become a popular topic, only 100 people were allowed to participate. Periel smiled as he thought that if the rumors had become so widespread in the capital, then the rumors were bound to reach Karina's once place of misery by now. The Leopold residence, the Count sat at his desk as usual, and Enfrisch walked in. As he approached the Count, Enfrisch told him about the rumors that had been circulating in the capital recently. The Count looked up, curious, and Enfrisch told him that it was also posted in the newspaper, but the Count sighed tiredly. He didn't have time to pay attention to trivial gossip in the capital since the Countess had been in a state recently. She constantly cries and is swallowed up in fits of anger because of Karina's silence. Enfrich's face darkened even more at the Count's words, and he told the Count that he would want to hear more about this rumor. But the Count did not take Enfrich's words to heart, because why would he have to entertain gossip from the capital that had nothing to do with him? Enfrisch told him about the rumors in the capital relating to an unknown painter, but this painter's name was unique. But the Count didn't have the time for this roundabout conversation and urged Enfrich impatiently to get to the point. Enfric did not meet the Count's eyes as he told him that the name of the artist was Karina. The name alarmed the Count, but he tried to reason that anyone out there could have the name Karina because that name hadn't had the Leopold last name attached to it. But the title going around the capital was Karina the Painter, the same title that Karina had written in the letter addressed to the Count. But the Count did not heed Enfrich's words and brushed it off unconcernedly. Enfrich's eyes grew cold as he realized the Count refused to see what was in front of him, and Enfrich said to him that when Duke Carlos had told him that Karina was sick, the Count refused to believe the Duke then as well. So would this time be the same now? Enfric shook his head in disappointment as he told the Count that if the Count still refused to believe in the happenings of Karina, he might miss the chance to see Karina for the last time. And these words triggered the Count to look further into himself as Enfric continued his rant. Hadn't she written in her letter that she would become a famous painter, only known as Karina the Painter? She would discard the Leopold name that only brought her misery, and she would leave behind her mark for people to remember, her paintings. As the last words left his lips, the Count finally questioned, putting the pieces together. The Carlos family supported this unknown artist, and Enfric informed him that Duke Carlos had remained silent on any matter involving the artist. The Count recalled the words he'd once read in the letter she left behind. "My name will spread far and wide, and it will eventually reach the south." He looked at the newspaper that Enfric had left on the table. It seemed to finally register that this unknown artist might actually be his daughter Karina. But if it truly was her, what should he do for Karina that no longer seemed to want to be his daughter?